Ladies and gents, and welcome to CG Reaction. And this is the loss of life in World War One visualized by the channel Real Life Lore. I reacted to the fallout of World War Two, and that's just one of the most horrible things of all time. Seeing all those death tolls in the World War Two, I knew it was more than World War One, but I didn't know at how much margin it's more. It was way much, but World War One wasn't that less either. World War One was the first time where it was so many millions died in any war. This is the first proper world war. It was basically a European war, but back then most of Asia and Africa was controlled by Europe, so they were all European colonies. So it became a world war, and in the end, America joined in too, USA. So yeah, millions and millions of people died every year. That hasn't happened in the past before the Great War. It was so horrible, and even people realized that millions and millions are dying. So even they call it the Great War. They didn't know that there's going to be another big one. But obviously, in just few decades, there was a humongous one. And World War II's death toll was so high because of the time the technology was so advanced. There was so much thing. Realize that before the World War II ended, atomic bombs were invented. So just imagine how great technology got advanced around that time compared to the past. So obviously they had tons and tons of millions of them, but World War One also had millions of deaths. So that was just horrible. If I were to guess, I think Russians died more, because that's the case with all the war. That's just stupid. In World War II, I'm definitely sure that's going to be case here. Even in the Napoleonic Wars, Russian dies a lot. It's surprising how there is any population left in Russia. There was a one time where heard that in Russia the women outnumber men by a large margin because of this. Men died a lot in wars. So first I think will be Russia, followed by I think by France or Britain. It's probably going to be Britain, since that one incident in trench warfare where lots of Britain civilians just went there to die. That's just effed up, because so other places French were occupied and they needed to relieve them from the German gunfire. So they were constantly attacking that. So in the trench warfare, it was just horrible. People just die left and right, just got mowed down by machine guns, and they still had to do it just to keep pressure. That's just heavy. Chemical warfare, and it's just lots of horrible thing happened in World War One. So yeah, let's watch the video.
This video is made possible by Skillshare. Learn anything you want to learn with Skillshare for free for 2 months at skl.sh/reallifelore18. I purposefully released this video on the 9th of November 2018. 2 days from now, on the 11th of November, will mark exactly 100 years since the end of the First World War, one of the most destructive and violent wars ever fought in human history. While the Second World War and the destruction it caused often overshadow the First World War, I felt like now would be a good time to remember and visualize the enormous loss of life.
Yeah, World War II's death toll is way more than this World War One's, but you have to understand, as in horrifying war. World War One, I think, was more horrifying. No, okay, not if you put side by side. Obviously, World War Two is going to be more horrifying than World War One. But I think World War One was more horrifying because this is when industrialized weapons were introduced, tanks, advanced airplanes, and gas attacks, chemical warfare. None of these things people knew before. So whenever soldiers went onto the battlefield, they didn't know what they're gonna get hit with, and they were surprised with these things. And just understand, with today, if some next level technology just comes in front of you, like I don't know, some kind of warp drive or something, how surprised would you be? It's not at that scale, but close to it. If you go in there thinking there's just going to be some gunfighting, maybe saber fighting, because that's what was common before World War One. And in World War One, there is a chemical attack. There's a smoke, weird smoke coming towards you. Like, what the hell is that? And then you start to get sick. How surprising would that be? In the air, machine gun fire happening through propellers. You'd be surprised, like, how are they doing that? Then the tanks, British introduced tanks. You see this metal box coming towards you, like, god damn. So there was a lots of things that were just industrialized level, next phase of civilization type of things that happened in World War I. That would surprise a lot of people. So I think just soldiers being on the battlefield, expecting something and then getting completely different and surprising that way. In that sense, it was really horrifying.
That the Great War caused. We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately, as well as deaths and injuries separately. A casualty can be a confusing statistic in war because it means that a soldier has been taken out of action, but not necessarily killed. Each of these models represents 1,000 people who died or went missing, while each of these
MI and KIA both are considered casualties, but they most time MIA results in death. They just don't know it if he's dead or not. So it's most time is killed in that case.
models represents 1,000 people who were injured, which when combined equal the number of casualties. And we'll begin the counting with the
that's
United
right. It's not just MI and KIA. Injured also considered casualty. Yeah.
States. Over 116,000 soldiers died, and another 204,000 were injured fighting against the Germans and Austrians on the Western Front. This amounted to 0.17% of the American population.
All right. Americans joined at the very end, and yet look at the numbers. And this was going on for 4 or 5 years. This is just horrible.
At the time becoming a casualty of war, but America only fought for a little over a year between 1917 and 1918. The war had already been going on for over 2.5 years before that. So let's take a look at some of the countries who were fighting from the beginning. The war began when Austria-Hungary declared war against Serbia in 1914, and Serbia suffered worse than any other country during the war. 375,000 Serb soldiers lost their lives in the fighting, while another 625,000 civilians died from famine and disease. That amounted to over 22% of the Serbian population dying during the 4-year-long war. More than 1 out of every 5 people in the country. Serbia was a member of one of the 2 alliances that fought against one another in the war called the Entente, which also included the United Kingdom, France, Russia, Italy, America, and many others, all of whom would suffer terribly. The United Kingdom would send over 815,000 soldiers to their graves, like on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, in which 19,000 would...
Battle of the Somme. In that, just British people just... soldiers, when he says soldiers, I'm like, that's a bit, misdirected. Lots of them were civilians. Just from the street. They're like, I'm going to fight for my country. Went there, went to that trenches and they just died. It's not like they had any chance. They went in that trenches, no man's land, and in the front of them were, machine guns. I mean, what the hell are they going to do? What is this, Matrix? They're going to slow motionly headshot the guy who has the machine gun? I mean, this was hopeless in the first, so that basically these civilians just went there just to die. That's just horrible, man.
Would die in only 24 hours, the bloodiest single day in British history. Over 123,000 British civilians also lost their lives during the war, totaling up to just over 2% of the British population, or about 1 in every 50 people dying. But many more...
2% is not just 2% a high number, man. When you consider an entire population, 2% is a lot of people.
Were wounded. 1,675,000 more soldiers, which adds together to 5.77% of the UK population then becoming casualties of the war. Subjects of the British Empire like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India, and South Africa also fought in the war and took high casualties. Percentage-wise, New Zealand suffered the worst, losing 3.8% of her population as wartime casualties, while numbers-wise, Australia took the hardest hit, losing over 61,000 of her soldiers.
Yeah, I mean, New Zealand has less population than Australia, so in that case, of course, they're gonna, percentage-wise, gonna be high.
Bring another 152,000 wounded, with Canada and India both not too far behind. But the other major Entente powers lost an incredible amount more. The Italians joined the war in 1915, but in 3 years of fighting suffered 555,000 military fatalities, along with 592,000 civilian deaths. Another 947,000 Italian soldiers became wounded, representing 5.8%.
When he says 500,000, this 100,000, I'm like, only gigantic things I've seen, obviously in TV, but it's like WWE WrestleMania. And some of the WrestleMania had tons of people. They say 100,000, but it's never 100. It's 80,000. So I've seen 80,000 in arena in WrestleMania, and I've seen how top and how small people look and how many people there are, and that's just 80,000. 500,000. I can't visualizing is hard. So many people just died like that. That's just effed up, man. In just this stupid war, in just matter of what 4 or so years, millions died. I can't even visualize million people. A million. These are millions that died. War is just stupid, man. War is no normal person wants a war. It's always people in power. First of all, when I reacted to the Epic Issue TV's World War One video, obviously I was saying that one guy got shot and everybody came to war. That's the point. That's the main thing around it. That's the how story goes. But that's not the case. Obviously, people just wanted an excuse to go to war. And when I say people in power. And because of that, lots of civilians died. And what the hell did people get?
Percent of the Italian population becoming casualties, a figure roughly comparable to the UK percentage. But then there's Russia and France, both of whom suffered higher casualties than the entire Serbian population combined during the war. Russia was the first country to come to Serbia's defense during the war and suffered catastrophic losses. 1,977,000 soldiers died fighting against the Central Powers, while another 1,140,000 civilians lost their lives. But Russia suffered vastly higher injuries, 4,350,000.
Alright, what the hell, 2-3 millions? In World War II they lost 8 million, and in World War II was just amplified really high. Every country lost immensely high. But if you ratio it out between World War I and World War II, Russia lost a lot of people in World War I, man. That's high number. I thought it would be 1.5 million or something like that. Not 2-3 millions. This is way too high.
Thousand soldiers were wounded during the fighting, which together represents 2.5% of the Russian population that became casualties. These enormous losses eventually helped contribute to Russia's spiral into revolution and their surrender in the war early into 1917. But percentage-wise, the Allied country that suffered during the war the most, besides Serbia, was France. Most of the Western Front took place in northeastern France and Belgium, and during 4 years of fighting, 1,377,000 French soldiers gave up their lives in defense of their country, along with 340,000 civilian fatalities. This represented a loss of life for 4.3% of the entire French population, but many, many more were wounded. 4,266,000 additional French soldiers were wounded or maimed by the war, representing a total casualty amount similar to Russia's, but from a much smaller population. In total, around 15% of France's population became a casualty during the First World War. A horrible loss of life that wouldn't be fully recovered 20 years later at the start of the Second World War. Other Entente countries in order of wartime casualties.
Is that why they, surrendered during the World War II? Because that's the big thing, isn't it? British makes jokes, Americans make jokes that French surrendered. But is that the case?
Romania, which also suffered terribly at 10.4% of their population becoming casualties, as well as Greece, Belgium, Portugal, Montenegro, and Japan, with only about 1,000 casualties during the entire war. But now let's take a look at the other side, the Central Powers, which were led by Germany. Germany was fighting on 2 fronts for most of the war and also suffered cataclysmic losses. 2,037,000 of her soldiers died fighting in the west and the east, and 594,000 of her civilians died largely due to starvation caused by the Allied blockade of the country. Another 2.5 million German soldiers were wounded during the course of the war.
That is much higher number, but I'm not surprised though, because Germany was basically tackling everybody alone. I mean, obviously Austria was with them. That felt stupid to me, because I don't care if it was an excuse or not. But the main point is, Archduke of Austria got shot and they went to war. Germany was just basically supporting them. So why was Germany at the head of everything? In the end, Austria even said, you know what, we're done. We are peace talk and we surrendered. Why is Germany in the end is like, you know what, we are still going to fight? That's just stupid.
War, amounting to 7.8% of Germany's population becoming a casualty. While Germany suffered the highest raw numbers of the Central Powers' casualties, she didn't suffer the highest percentage-wise. While Austria-Hungary took less casualties overall, they represented a higher proportion of that empire's population, 10.77%. Over 1.3 million soldiers were killed and another 3.6 million injured, all of which helps to explain why the Austro-Hungarian Empire itself wasn't able to survive the war. But the worst suffering on the Central Powers side occurred inside of the Ottoman Empire, and most of it was self-inflicted. The Ottomans joined the war in 1915 and suffered 548,000 military fatalities, and another 582,000 wounded fighting against mostly the British, French, and the Russians. But absurdly high civilian deaths inside of the Ottoman Empire were largely due to the Ottoman government's policy of ethnic cleansing against her Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian ethnic minorities. Collectively known as the Armenian Genocide, 1.5 million Armenians were systematically killed by the Ottoman government during and shortly after the war, along with 600,000 Greeks and 225,000 Assyrians. Accounting for all of this in addition to the military casualties, an enormous 17% of the Ottoman Empire's population was killed or wounded during the conflict, which can also help to explain why this empire too didn't survive long after the war was over. And finally,
I hate the people who like, you know what, you're this, you're that, you're Armenian. Doesn't matter if you're a just 5-year-old kid, 2-year-old kid, you are just kids and you're powerless. I'm just gonna kill you because you're Armenian. That's just effed up, man. I mean, people are, showing aggression to each other and kill each other. At least I can understand that. Just killing civilians, poor civilians. I mean, there are photos of Armenian genocide where just small kids are just walking around and, most of them died because, government thought they are Armenian, just kill them. It's just, oh my God. I hate people like that.
Bulgaria was another member of this alliance that suffered greatly as well, with 6.8% of their population becoming casualty victims of the Great War. In total, and across all countries, about 9 million soldiers lost their lives, as well as 7 million civilians. 36% of all deaths were Entente military, 22% were the Central Powers military, another 22% were Central Powers civilians, and the final 20% were Entente civilians. The First World War was and still remains the bloodiest war ever fought in the history of the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Belgium, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Turkey, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. The Second World War was actually not as bad for all of these mentioned countries, but it would be worse for others like Russia and Germany. Hopefully, after 2 terrible
Also
lessons
Americans.
during the 20th century, humanity will never...
I bet Americans has bigger death count than they had in World War One because they joined in the middle, I think. While in World War One they joined very late, last year. But still, they lost a lot of people even in World War One. That's surprising. I guess in the end it was too intense, so people died a lot.
Never forget what can happen when we let our differences get the better of us. Lessons of any kind are valuable for both societies and for individuals. And if you made it all the way through this video to here, it's clear that you enjoy learning. So why not learn even more about anything you want to by going over to Skillshare next.
Yeah, people, go to skillshare.com/real-life-lore18 and support that channel. This was a good video, man. This puts into perspective. I knew the World War II had more casualties than World War I, but I had no idea World War I had this much casualties. This is a lot, like 16 or something millions. That's just an Armenian genocide. That just pisses me off. Because it's not just that they did that. Obviously, there's been genocide in the past, but even today they are like, there is no Armenian genocide. You cannot just wipe 1.5 million people off the map and say that didn't happen. In even most countries, because I don't know, some relations and they need oil or something, most major countries in the world also, they don't say the Armenian genocide didn't happen, but they don't correct the people that say that didn't happen. They don't correct them either. That also pisses me off because there is some, relations and conflict with them. This is a depressing video, but still, this puts things into perspective, I guess. World War III will have hundreds of millions of casualties, and that will be the end of it. People like the game released Cyberpunk 2077 and all that, future world, Blade Runner movie, that type of people like when that's going to happen. If a war happen, that's not going to happen. There is not going to be. We are going back to stick and stones. You'll be like, but we can always build again. But what if the people who has the knowledge how to build all the technology dies too? And very few people left and none of them know anything about science or anything like that. What if then? Because you would think that lots of people are, have this scientific intellect, but they don't. Majority of people don't. Alright, if you like my reaction, don't forget to like and subscribe.